When people talk about the Catholic Church, they often imagine a single, unified structure with one way of thinking, praying, and living out the faith. But beneath that surface is a much more complex reality. Inside the Church exists a vast network of religious orders, each shaped by a different answer to the same fundamental question: what is the best way to live the Christian life in the world? These orders are not denominations. They do not disagree on core doctrine, and they all exist under the authority of the same Church. But they differ dramatically in emphasis, mission, spirituality, and method. Some are built around contemplation and stability. Others are built around movement, mission, and adaptation. Some prioritize education and intellectual formation. Others focus on poverty, direct service, or evangelization at the margins of society. What makes religious orders especially important is that they act like living experiments within Catholicism. Each one takes a particular insight about faith and pushes it as far as it can go. Over centuries, this has produced institutions that have shaped universities, missions, science, social reform, global politics, and even how Catholicism understands itself across different cultures. If you want to understand why Catholicism looks different in different places, you have to understand its religious orders. In this series, we're going to look at the 10 largest Catholic religious orders, not to rank them by holiness or importance, but to understand how each one works from the inside. One order at a time. One complete narrative at a time, each explored on its own terms, with its own logic, history, and way of engaging the world. This isn't about deciding which order is right or wrong. It's about understanding how many different paths can exist inside a single religious tradition and why those differences matter. Number 1. The Society of Jesus, Jesuits. The Society of Jesus didn't begin as a quiet monastery movement. It didn't start with monks withdrawing from the world, building walls, or creating stable communities meant to last for centuries in one place. It started with a man who thought like a soldier, planned like a strategist, and prayed like a mystic. And that combination changed everything. Ignatius of Loyola didn't imagine an order rooted in stillness. He imagined an order built for movement. Not just physical movement, but intellectual, cultural, and spiritual movement. His vision wasn't to protect the Church from the world, but to send people directly into it. Wherever the Church was weakest, wherever it was confused, wherever it was losing ground. That's where the Jesuits were supposed to go. That single idea shaped the entire identity of the order. From the beginning, Jesuits were different. Most religious orders organize life around stability. A monastery, a rhythm, a location, a predictable structure. Jesuits organized around a mission. A Jesuit isn't defined primarily by where he lives, but by where he's sent. That might be a university, a slum, a mission field, a refugee camp, a research institution, a diplomatic post, a parish, a war zone. The location doesn't matter. The need does. And that makes the Jesuit identity inherently fluid. They don't see themselves as guardians of a fixed tradition in the same way older monastic orders do. They see themselves as instruments, tools, agents of a mission that moves as the world moves. Their question is never, how do we preserve what exists? It's, where is the Church most needed right now? That mindset explains almost everything else about them. It explains why education became one of their defining marks. Jesuits didn't build schools just to train priests. They built universities, colleges, and institutions that shaped entire societies. Because they understood something early on. Culture is formed long before beliefs are debated. Ideas shape politics. Education shapes values. Intellectual formation shapes how people think about truth itself. So the Jesuits went where minds were being formed. But their relationship with knowledge has always been different. They don't treat faith and reason as enemies. They don't treat science as a threat. They don't treat philosophy as dangerous. Their instinct is integration, not separation. If something is true, they believe it ultimately belongs to God, whether it comes from theology, physics, history, or psychology. That's why Jesuits became astronomers, mathematicians, linguists, scientists, historians, and philosophers alongside theologians. Not because they replaced faith with reason, but because they believed faith doesn't need protection from reality. This also shaped their missionary approach. When Jesuits went to new cultures, they didn't begin with destruction. They began with understanding. They learned languages. They studied local philosophies. They observed social structures. They tried to understand how people already thought about meaning, morality, order, and transcendence. Their method wasn't erase and replace. It was translate and transform. This made them effective and controversial because from the outside, adaptation can look like a compromise. Cultural sensitivity can look like dilution. Dialogue can look like weakness. And throughout history, other Catholics often accused Jesuits of going too far, blending too much, accommodating too easily. But from the Jesuit perspective, this wasn't a compromise. It was a strategy. If the message is universal, then the expression can't be uniform. Truth has to speak the language of the people who hear it. That logic made them extraordinarily successful in places like Asia, Africa, and Latin America. But it also made them politically dangerous. Because once you understand cultures, once you understand systems of power, once you understand how societies function, you gain influence whether you seek it or not. And the Jesuits did gain influence. They became advisors to kings, teachers of elites, confessors to rulers, educators of future leaders. And that kind of influence always creates suspicion. Governments began to see them as too powerful, too organized, too independent, too loyal to Rome rather than to the state. Eventually, this fear led to something almost unimaginable. Entire Catholic nations pressured the Pope to suppress the order completely. And for decades, the Society of Jesus officially ceased to exist. But even then, the Jesuit spirit didn't disappear. Former members continued their work quietly. Education continued. Missions continued. Spiritual formation continued. The structure was gone, but the identity survived. And when the order was restored, it returned with the same internal logic: mobility, obedience, adaptability, mission. At the heart of Jesuit spirituality is discernment. Not certainty, not rigidity, not emotionalism. Discernment. The idea that the spiritual life isn't about escaping complexity, but learning how to navigate it faithfully. Jesuits are trained to pay attention to inner movements, desires, fears, motivations, patterns. Not every strong feeling is good. Not every calm feeling is holy. Not every good intention leads to a good outcome. So the spiritual task becomes learning how to tell the difference. This creates a very particular type of religious personality. Jesuits are trained to live in ambiguity without losing direction, to operate in complexity without abandoning principle, to engage the world without becoming absorbed by it. That's why they often appear comfortable in morally gray environments. Politics, education, social systems, cultural conflicts. These are not spaces of clean lines and easy answers. But Jesuit spirituality is built precisely for those spaces, not to control them, not to dominate them, but to navigate them. This also explains why Jesuits often frustrate people who prefer clarity over process. Some Catholics want firm boundaries, immediate answers, and stable structures. Jesuits tend to emphasize journey, discernment, development, and context. That difference in temperament alone creates tension, because one side asks, "What is the rule?" and the other asks, "What is God doing here?" Neither question is wrong, but they lead to very different instincts. Jesuits also hold a unique relationship with authority. They emphasize obedience deeply, especially obedience to the Pope. But their obedience isn't mechanical. It's not blind submission. It's strategic alignment. They see the Pope not just as a figure of authority, but as a symbol of global mission. Obedience becomes a way of participating in something larger than themselves. So a Jesuit can live a life that looks very independent, very creative, very autonomous, while being deeply bound by obedience internally. That tension is part of their identity. They are free, but not self-directed, mobile, but not independent, flexible, but not detached. This combination is rare, and it makes them difficult to categorize. In the modern world, Jesuits remain one of the most influential religious orders globally. They shape education systems. They participate in scientific research. They engage social justice movements. They influence theological debate. They operate in diplomacy, development, and humanitarian work. And that visibility keeps them under constant scrutiny. Some see them as too political. Some see them as too progressive. Some see them as too intellectual. Some see them as too ambiguous. But all of these reactions point to the same reality. Jesuits operate where ideas, power, and faith intersect. And those spaces are never comfortable. They were never meant to be. The Society of Jesus doesn't exist to create safe religious enclaves. It exists to go where stability breaks down, where cultures shift, where belief is questioned, where institutions fail, where people lose meaning, where systems collapse. Their vocation isn't preservation, it's engagement. And that's what makes them both indispensable and controversial inside Catholicism. They are not the Church's anchor. They are its scouts, its navigators, its explorers. Sometimes they find solid ground. Sometimes they make mistakes. Sometimes they move too fast. Sometimes they move too slowly. But they are always moving. The Jesuits show one possible way of being Catholic, not rooted in place, but in mission, not defined by structure, but by availability, not centered on stability, but on response. They don't represent the whole church. They never claim to. They represent one answer to a single question. How do you live a life of faith in a world that never stops changing? Their answer is simple in theory, difficult in practice. Go where you're needed. Learn before you speak. Discern before you act. Serve without clinging. Adapt without losing identity. That's the Jesuit logic. And whether people admire them or distrust them, one thing is undeniable. The Society of Jesus didn't just shape Catholicism. It helped shape the modern world's relationship with religion itself. Not through control, not through domination, but through presence, influence, and engagement. Always moving, always adapting, always sent. Number 2. The Salesians of Don Bosco. If the Jesuits were built to move wherever ideas, power, and culture collide, the Salesians were built to go where society quietly fails and usually looks away. Not into royal courts or universities at first, but into streets filled with abandoned children, exploited teenagers, and young people who had already learned that the world didn't care whether they succeeded or disappeared. The Salesians begin with a different question. Not, where is the church losing influence, but who is being left behind? The order was founded in the 19th century by John Bosco, better known as Don Bosco, in an Italy that was industrializing faster than its social structures could handle. Cities were swelling. Families were breaking apart. Children were being pushed into factories, prisons, and the streets. And most institutions, religious or political, treated these young people as problems rather than persons. Don Bosco didn't see them that way. He saw something else. He saw potential that hadn't been given a chance to grow. And instead of building a theology first or designing a system on paper, he started with presence. He showed up. He played with them. He talked to them. He fed them. He educated them. He protected them. And slowly, a method emerged. That method became the heart of the Salesians. Unlike many religious orders that define themselves by a specific spiritual discipline or theological focus, the Salesians define themselves by a mission group, young people, especially the poor and marginalized. Everything else flows from that. Their spirituality, their educational approach, their community life, and even their tone. Salesians are not primarily contemplatives. They are not cloistered. They are not detached observers. Their vocation is relational. They believe young people are formed less by rules and fear, and more by trust, encouragement, and presence. This belief led to what Don Bosco called the preventive system. The idea is simple but radical. Instead of waiting for young people to fail and then punishing them, you prevent failure by creating an environment where growth becomes natural. Education, recreation, faith, and mentorship all work together. Discipline exists, but it's rooted in relationship, not control. Authority is exercised, but it's personal, not distant. Salesians don't ask, how do we enforce order? They ask, how do we keep hope alive? That single shift changes everything. It changes how they teach. Salesian education isn't just about academics. It's about forming the whole person. Skills, character, work ethic, responsibility, and self-respect matter just as much as test scores. Many Salesian institutions emphasize vocational training because they understand something practical. Dignity is closely tied to competence. If you can work, create, and contribute, you're far less likely to be crushed by poverty or exploitation. It also changes how they evangelize. Salesians don't lead with doctrine. They lead with trust. Faith is presented as something lived, not imposed. Something shared, not enforced. Don Bosco famously said that young people don't need to be loved. They need to know that they are loved. That principle remains central to Salesian identity. This approach made the order grow rapidly. As industrialization spread, so did the problems it created. And wherever there were displaced young people, the Salesians found work to do. Oratories, schools, youth centers, shelters, and technical institutes became their natural environment. Over time, the Salesians became one of the largest religious orders in the world, not because they pursued influence, but because need pursued them. Their global expansion followed migration and poverty patterns rather than political centers. Latin America, Africa, Asia, places where young populations were growing fast and resources were scarce. The Salesians didn't arrive with abstract solutions. They arrived with classrooms, workshops, playgrounds, and mentors. Internally, the Salesian community life reflects this outward focus. Their houses are not silent monasteries. They're busy, loud, full of movement. Prayer exists, but it's integrated into daily life rather than separated from it. A Salesian is expected to be accessible, approachable, and visibly present. This has consequences. Salesians tend to be pragmatic rather than speculative. They are less interested in theological debates than in whether a school is functioning, whether a student has food, and whether a teenager has a future. That doesn't mean they lack theology. It means theology is always tested against reality. Does this belief help young people live better lives? Does this practice create hope or despair? Does this structure protect or exclude? Those questions guide decisions. Because of this, Salesians are often deeply embedded in local communities. They know families. They know neighborhoods. They know the names, stories, and struggles of the people they serve. Their authority doesn't come from distance or formality. It comes from trust built over time. And like all effective approaches, this one has critics. Some argue that the Salesian method risks softness. It prioritizes comfort over discipline, that it avoids hard truths. Others worry that focusing so heavily on youth can lead to neglect of broader theological formation. But Salesians would respond that formation doesn't happen in abstraction. It happens in relationships. You don't form people by talking at them. You form them by walking with them. That belief shapes how Salesians understand holiness itself. For them, sanctity doesn't look like withdrawal or extraordinary mysticism. It looks like patience, consistency, presence, showing up every day, listening, teaching, encouraging, correcting without crushing. In the modern world, this mission has only become more complex. Young people now face different pressures: digital isolation, economic precarity, mental health crises, cultural fragmentation, and Salesians have adapted accordingly. Their institutions now include counseling services, social programs, migrant outreach, and digital education initiatives. But the core logic remains unchanged. Young people are not problems to be solved. They are persons to be formed. Salesians also emphasize joy in a way that feels almost countercultural in religious life. Don Bosco believed that holiness and happiness were not opposites. A gloomy saint, in his view, was a contradiction. So Salesian spirituality includes play, celebration, humor, and community life as essential elements, not distractions. This doesn't mean they ignore suffering. It means they refuse to let suffering define the entire narrative. Joy becomes resistance. Hope becomes discipline. Presence becomes transformation. Today, the Salesians remain one of the largest Catholic religious orders in the world. They operate thousands of institutions across continents. Their influence is most visible not in elite spaces, but in everyday lives. Former students, skilled workers, teachers, parents, citizens shaped quietly by a community that believed in them before they believed in themselves. They rarely produce famous theologians or public intellectuals. That's not their mission. Their success is harder to measure. It shows up years later in lives that didn't fall apart, in young people who found stability instead of despair. The Salesians represent one particular answer to the Christian question: not how to change the world through ideas, but how to change it through people. One relationship at a time, one classroom, one workshop, one conversation. They remind the Church of something essential. Faith doesn't only survive through doctrine and institutions. It survives through care, through patience, through presence. And sometimes, the most powerful religious work doesn't happen in cathedrals or universities, but in noisy rooms filled with young people who are still deciding who they're going to become. That's the Salesian vision. And that vision continues, quietly, wherever young people are waiting for someone to take them seriously. Number 3. The Order of Friars Minor, Franciscans. If the Jesuits were shaped by strategy and the Salesians by presence, the Franciscans were shaped by renunciation. Not symbolic renunciation, not poetic simplicity, but a radical decision to step out of the structures that define success, security, and control, and to live as though those things were never the point in the first place. The Order of Friars Minor begins with a man who didn't try to fix the church by reforming its institutions or clarifying its theology. Francis of Assisi tried to fix it by imitating Christ as literally as possible. Not metaphorically, not selectively, literally. Francis looked at the gospel and saw a pattern that felt uncomfortable even to deeply religious people. Christ poor, Christ itinerant, Christ vulnerable, Christ is dependent on others. And instead of asking how to interpret that pattern, Francis asked how to live it. That question created a shockwave. The Franciscans weren't founded to run schools, advise rulers, or build stable communities. They were founded to live without ownership, without power, and without guarantees. Their original ideal wasn't efficiency. It was faithfulness. And that faithfulness was measured not by success, but by dependence. Francis believed that poverty wasn't just a social condition. It was a spiritual posture. To own nothing was to place yourself completely in God's hands and in the hands of others. You couldn't dominate. You couldn't control outcomes. You couldn't insulate yourself from risk. You had to trust. That trust became the core of Franciscan identity. Franciscans didn't withdraw into monasteries. They lived among people. They begged for food. They worked when they could. They preached in public spaces. They slept where they were allowed to sleep. Their presence wasn't authoritative. It was exposed. And that exposure was the point. Where other religious orders built stability, Franciscans embraced instability. Where others accumulated resources to sustain institutions, Franciscans deliberately refused ownership. They wanted nothing that would separate them from the poor. Not property, not wealth, not privilege, not even long-term security. This approach made them deeply compelling and deeply unsettling because Franciscan poverty wasn't theoretical. It confronted people with uncomfortable questions. If this way of life is possible, then what does that say about the rest of us? If joy can exist without possession, then what exactly are we protecting? The Franciscan answer wasn't a condemnation. It was a witness. Franciscans didn't argue people into conversion. They embodied a different logic and invited others to notice it. Their preaching wasn't complex. It was direct. God is good. Creation is good. Life is a gift. Love is concrete. And following Christ changes how you relate to everything else. That worldview also shaped their relationship with nature. Francis didn't see creation as neutral or disposable. He saw it as relational. Brother sun, sister moon. Not poetic sentiment, but theological conviction. Creation participates in praise simply by existing. And humans, rather than dominating it, are meant to live within it responsibly. This gave Franciscan spirituality a tone that feels unusually warm, grounded, and accessible. It isn't abstract. It isn't system-heavy. It's experiential. It asks how you live, not just what you think. But the Franciscan ideal was hard to sustain. As the order grew rapidly, practical problems emerged. How do you educate members if you own nothing? How do you house large communities without property? How do you organize a charity without resources? These questions created internal tensions almost immediately. Some Franciscans wanted to interpret poverty strictly. No ownership at all. No compromises. Others believed some structure was necessary to sustain the mission. That tension didn't destroy the order, but it did shape it. Over time, different branches emerged, each trying to remain faithful to Francis while navigating reality. The Order of Friars Minor represents one attempt to hold that balance. Still committed to poverty, but structured enough to operate globally. Still itinerant in spirit, but capable of sustaining communities, parishes, and ministries. Despite these developments, the Franciscan instinct never fully shifted toward power. Even when Franciscans became teachers, confessors, missionaries, and administrators, their identity remained rooted in humility and closeness to ordinary life. They didn't position themselves above people. They positioned themselves beside them. This made Franciscans particularly effective preachers. They spoke in images rather than abstractions, stories rather than systems. They appealed to conscience rather than authority. Their sermons weren't about winning arguments. They were about raising awareness, about noticing God in daily life, about reconnecting faith with concrete action. Franciscans also played a major role in missions, but their approach differed from that of more strategic orders. They emphasized presence over influence, living among people, sharing daily life, learning local customs. Their authority came from shared vulnerability rather than institutional power. This approach made them beloved in many places. It also made them ineffective in others. Poverty doesn't always translate into influence. Simplicity doesn't always persuade systems built on power. And Franciscans accepted that trade-off. They weren't trying to shape the world from the top down. They were trying to remind them of what mattered from the bottom up. Internally, Franciscan community life reflects this ethos. Their houses are simpler. Their structures are less rigid. Their spirituality emphasizes fraternity rather than hierarchy. Authority exists, but it's meant to serve communion rather than command obedience. A Franciscan is formed to ask different questions. Am I clinging to something unnecessarily? Am I trusting possessions more than providence? Am I close enough to those who suffer? These aren't abstract spiritual exercises. They're practical examinations of conscience. In modern times, Franciscans have had to reinterpret poverty in a world very different from medieval Europe. Total material destitution doesn't always serve the poor. Social systems are more complex. Needs are more structural. So Franciscans today engage in education, advocacy, environmental protection, and social justice work. But even here, the Franciscan lens remains distinctive. They don't approach justice primarily through ideology. They approach it through a relationship, through solidarity, through shared vulnerability. Their advocacy grows out of lived proximity to suffering, not detached analysis. This makes their voice softer, but often more credible. Franciscans also maintain a deep commitment to peace. Francis himself crossed battle lines to speak with enemies, not as a diplomat, but as a witness. That spirit continues. Franciscans tend to resist violent solutions instinctively, not because they're naive, but because they believe violence corrodes the soul of both victim and perpetrator. Their vision of holiness is not heroic in the conventional sense. It's gentle, ordinary, patient. It shows up in care for the sick, presence among the poor, fidelity in small tasks, and joy that doesn't depend on comfort. That joy is crucial. Franciscans aren't grim ascetics. Their poverty isn't a rejection of happiness. It's a redefinition of it. Happiness, for them, comes from freedom. Freedom from excess. Freedom from comparison. Freedom from fear of loss. That freedom makes room for gratitude. And gratitude, in Franciscan spirituality, becomes praise. Today, the Order of Friars Minor remains one of the largest Catholic religious orders in the world. Their members serve in parishes, missions, shelters, schools, hospitals, and advocacy organizations across continents. Their influence isn't concentrated in centers of power. It's dispersed wherever life is fragile. They don't claim to have the complete answer to Christian life. They offer one answer, a demanding one, a destabilizing one, a quietly radical one. What if faith isn't about accumulating certainty, influence, or success? What if it's about letting go until love has room to grow? That's the Franciscan question. And centuries later, it still unsettles people for the same reason it always has. Because it doesn't ask whether you believe the right things. It asks what you're willing to live without. Number 4. The Order of Friars Minor Capuchins. If the Franciscans asked what happens when you take poverty seriously, the Capuchins asked what happens when you take it even further. Not as an idea, not as a symbol, but as a way of life stripped down to its bare essentials. The Capuchins didn't begin as something entirely new. They began as a reaction, a return, a protest from within the Franciscan family itself. Because over time, even the Franciscans had accumulated structures, compromises, and adaptations that some members felt were drifting too far from the original vision of Francis of Assisi. The Capuchin instinct was simple and uncompromising. Go back. Back to simplicity. Back to austerity. Back to prayer. Back to visible poverty. They weren't interested in refining the Franciscan project. They wanted to purify it. The name Capuchin itself comes from the distinctive hood, the cappuccio, worn as part of their habit. It wasn't designed to stand out. It was designed to disappear, to signal humility, anonymity, and closeness to ordinary people. Over time, that simple hood became one of the most recognizable symbols of radical religious poverty in the Catholic world. But the habit wasn't the point. It was a sign of something deeper. Capuchins believed that poverty wasn't just about owning less. It was about being less impressive, less protected, less insulated. They intentionally embraced lives that looked rough, uncomfortable, and even socially marginal. They lived simply, ate simply, spoke simply. Their preaching style matched their appearance: direct, emotional, concrete, and accessible. Unlike more intellectual orders, Capuchins didn't aim to impress minds first. They aimed to move hearts. This made them extraordinarily effective preachers. Capuchin sermons were not academic lectures. They were vivid, urgent, filled with imagery drawn from daily life. They spoke about sin, mercy, death, forgiveness, and hope in language people actually understood. They weren't afraid of emotion. Tears were not a failure of preaching. They were often the goal. The Capuchins believed people didn't need complexity to encounter God. They needed honesty. That emphasis on honesty extended to their spiritual life. Capuchins cultivated a deep interior prayer life, but it wasn't mystical in the abstract sense. It was personal, a relationship marked by trust, struggle, and dependence. Prayer wasn't a retreat from suffering. It was a way of surviving it. This spirituality gave rise to a particular type of holiness. Capuchin saints are often remembered not as scholars or administrators, but as confessors, healers, and companions to the poor. They were the ones people trusted with their secrets, their fears, their guilt, their grief. Because Capuchins didn't speak from above, they spoke from alongside. This closeness to suffering also explains why Capuchins were frequently present during crises. Plagues, wars, famines, social collapse. While others fled, Capuchins often stayed, not out of heroism, but out of vocation. Their poverty meant they had less to lose. Their prayer meant they were already familiar with vulnerability, and vulnerability became their strength. Capuchins also emphasized fraternity distinctively. Their communities were small, tight-knit, and intentionally non-hierarchical in spirit. Authority existed, but it was exercised with restraint. Leadership was meant to serve unity, not efficiency. A Capuchin community wasn't meant to run like an institution. It was meant to feel like a family. This family model extended outward. Capuchins didn't just serve the poor. They lived among them. Their houses were modest, their doors open. They begged publicly, not as a performance, but as a necessity. This visibility made poverty unavoidable. You couldn't spiritualize it away when you had to depend on others for survival. And that dependence was formative. It forced humility. It dissolved illusions of control. It stripped away the fantasy of self-sufficiency. Capuchins believed that only when those illusions were gone could genuine faith take root. Over time, this radical simplicity attracted people, especially those disillusioned with power, wealth, and formality. The Capuchins grew rapidly, becoming one of the largest Franciscan branches in the world. Their growth wasn't driven by prestige. It was driven by credibility. People trusted them. They trusted them because Capuchins didn't benefit materially from their trust. They had no stake in social advancement, no hidden agenda, no institutional ambition. Their very lifestyle testified to their sincerity. This credibility also made them effective missionaries. When Capuchins arrived in new regions, they didn't arrive as representatives of power. They arrived as poor men among the poor. That posture opened doors that strategy never could. Capuchin missions often focused on marginalized communities, indigenous populations, and places where the church lacked resources or influence. Their success wasn't measured in numbers or institutions, but in relationships formed and lives accompanied. Of course, this radicalism came at a cost. Living without resources means vulnerability to burnout. Living close to suffering means emotional exhaustion. Living without institutional power means limited capacity to affect large-scale change. Capuchins accepted these limits. They weren't trying to fix everything. They were trying to be faithful. And faithfulness, for them, meant staying small. In the modern world, this presents challenges. Contemporary society values efficiency, scale, and impact. Capuchin life resists all three. Their communities remain modest. Their projects are limited. Their influence is quiet. But that quiet presence still matters. In hospitals, prisons, shelters, and parishes, Capuchins continue to serve as confessors and spiritual guides. Their ministry often centers on reconciliation, mercy, and accompaniment rather than instruction. They listen more than they speak. And when they speak from experience. Capuchins also embody a corrective within the Church itself. When Catholicism risks becoming too institutional, too polished, too distant from ordinary life, the Capuchins stand as a reminder of its origins. A reminder that Christianity began among the poor. That credibility flows from sacrifice. That authority is earned through humility. Their life asks uncomfortable questions. What if success isn't the goal? What if holiness looks unimpressive? What if being needed matters more than being influential? These questions don't have easy answers. But Capuchins live them anyway. They don't offer a blueprint for reform. They offer a witness. A stubborn, enduring witness that says faith doesn't need refinement to be real. It needs sincerity. Today, the Capuchins remain one of the largest religious orders within the Franciscan family and within the Catholic Church as a whole. Their numbers may fluctuate, but their identity remains remarkably consistent. Simple, prayerful, close to the poor, close to suffering, close to God. They are not loud voices in theological debate. They are not power brokers. They are not innovators in strategy. They are something rarer. They are a presence. And in a world addicted to speed, scale, and spectacle, that presence continues to speak with surprising force. Not because it demands attention, but because it refuses to compete for it. Number 5. The Order of Saint Benedict, Benedictines. Almost equals 1,500 words, single voice, cinematic script, one order only. If the Franciscans asked what happens when you let go of everything, the Benedictines asked what happens when you stay. Do not stay emotionally. Stay physically. Stay committed to a place, a community, and a rhythm of life that doesn't change just because the world does. The Benedictines are almost the opposite of mobile orders like the Jesuits or outward-facing ones like the Franciscans. They aren't defined by mission fields or adaptability. They're defined by stability. And that single choice shaped Western Christianity more than almost any other religious decision in history. The Benedictine story begins not with reform or protest, but with exhaustion. In a collapsing Roman world marked by political chaos, violence, and moral confusion, Benedict of Nursia didn't try to fix society directly. He withdrew from it, not to escape responsibility, but to rebuild something human from the ground up. His insight was simple and quietly radical. If you want to heal a broken world, you start by forming a stable, disciplined, humane community. And so Benedict wrote a rule, not a philosophical treatise, not a mystical manifesto, a rule for daily life. How to pray, how to work, how to eat, how to sleep, how to obey, how to disagree, how to forgive, how to live together without destroying one another. That rule became the foundation of Benedictine life. At the heart of it is balance, prayer and work, silence and speech, authority and consultation, discipline and mercy. The Benedictine motto often gets summarized as ora et labora, pray and work, but that phrase only works because neither side is allowed to dominate the other. Prayer without work becomes escapism. Work without prayer becomes slavery. Benedict wanted neither. Unlike later religious orders, Benedictines do not define themselves by a specific external mission. They don't exist primarily to preach, teach, or evangelize in the usual sense. Their mission is their life. If they live well, the world is served indirectly. That means Benedictine monasteries are meant to be places of order in a disordered world. Places where time is structured, where meals are shared, where authority is exercised with restraint, where the strong are checked and the weak are protected, and crucially, where people stay. Benedictines take a vow of stability. They commit not just to a community, but to a specific place. In a world obsessed with mobility and choice, that decision feels almost incomprehensible. But for Benedictines, stability is not a limitation. It's formation. You don't grow by constantly restarting. You grow by staying long enough to be shaped. Staying forces you to confront yourself. You can't outrun your flaws when you live with the same people every day for decades. You can reinvent yourself when your community remembers who you were last year and the year before that. This is intentional. Benedict believed holiness wasn't produced by intensity, but by consistency. Not heroic effort, but daily faithfulness. You pray even when you don't feel like it. You work even when it's boring. You obey even when you disagree. And over time, something changes. Not the world's first. You. This slow, patient approach is why Benedictines became cultural stabilizers rather than revolutionaries. As the Roman Empire fell apart, Benedictine monasteries quietly preserved literacy, agriculture, craftsmanship, and learning. They copied manuscripts, developed farming techniques, provided hospitality, offered education, cared for travelers and the poor. They weren't trying to save civilization. They were trying to live faithfully. Civilization survived partly because of it. Benedictine authority also works differently. Abbots are real authorities, but they are not absolute rulers. The rule insists that leaders listen, especially to the youngest members, because wisdom isn't always where power resides. Authority exists to serve the community, not dominate it. This creates a distinctive tone. Benedictine life isn't dramatic. There are no sudden conversions, radical gestures, or public spectacles. Change happens quietly, gradually, often imperceptibly, and that slowness is part of its strength. In a Benedictine monastery, time matters. The hours of prayer structure the day. The liturgy sanctifies time itself. Instead of rushing through life, Benedictines learn to inhabit it, to be present, to do one thing at a time. That presence spills outward. Benedictine hospitality is famous for a reason. Guests are treated as Christ himself, not metaphorically, but practically. The stranger is welcomed, federal, given rest, listened to. Hospitality isn't optional. It's a command. This openness creates a paradox. Benedictines live enclosed lives, yet their monasteries become centers of encounter. Pilgrims, travelers, students, neighbors, all are drawn into the rhythm, even briefly, and many leave changed, not because they were taught something, but because they experienced something different. A life not ruled by urgency. Benedictine spirituality also has a realistic view of human nature. Benedict didn't assume monks were saints. He assumed they were difficult, lazy, proud, stubborn. His rule accounts for weakness. It allows for failure. It emphasizes patience over punishment. Discipline exists, but it's medicinal, not retributive. Correction is meant to heal, not humiliate. Mercy is not weakness. It's wisdom. This realism is one reason Benedictine life endured while many extreme ascetic movements collapsed. Benedict didn't demand perfection. He demanded perseverance. Over time, Benedictine monasteries diversified. Different congregations emerged. Different emphases developed. Some focused on scholarship, others on agriculture, others on liturgy or education. But the core logic remained the same: stability, balance, community. In the modern world, Benedictines face unique challenges. A culture built on speed, choice, and constant stimulation struggles to understand vows of permanence and silence. Recruitment fluctuates. Monasteries age. And yet, interest in Benedictine spirituality has grown among lay people because the problems Benedict addressed never went away. Distraction, fragmentation, burnout, loneliness. These are modern crises, but Benedict offered tools for them centuries ago. Rhythm, community, limits, silence, work done well, prayer that grounds rather than escapes. Benedictines today continue to run schools, retreat centers, parishes, and monasteries. But their influence is often indirect. They shape culture by modeling an alternative way of being human. They remind the Church that faith doesn't only spread through mission and proclamation. Sometimes it spreads through example, through stability, through lives that make sense. The Benedictine question is quiet, but persistent. What if the most radical thing you can do is stay? What if transformation comes not from intensity, but from fidelity? What if holiness looks like showing up tomorrow, and the next day, and the next? These aren't glamorous questions. They don't attract headlines, but they shape lives. The Order of Saint Benedict represents a vision of Christianity rooted not in expansion, but in depth, not in speed, but in endurance, not in influence, but in faithfulness. In a world constantly pulling people apart, Benedictines hold things together. And in doing so, they offer something increasingly rare, a life that isn't in a hurry. Number 6. The Order of Preachers, Dominicans. If the Benedictines believed stability could heal a fractured world, the Dominicans believed clarity could. Not clarity is aggression. Not clarity is domination. But clarity is a form of service. Because when truth becomes confused, people don't just make intellectual mistakes. They lose direction. And for the Dominicans, that loss of direction was a pastoral crisis. The Order of Preachers was founded in response to a problem that couldn't be solved by withdrawal or poverty alone. In parts of medieval Europe, large numbers of people were leaving the church not because they rejected faith, but because they found its explanations unconvincing. Alternative movements offered answers that felt coherent, disciplined, and intellectually serious. And the church often responded with authority rather than understanding. Dominic saw that this wasn't enough. He believed that if faith was true, it had nothing to fear from reason. And if people were leaving because Christianity no longer made sense to them, then the solution wasn't force or silence. It was better thinking, better teaching, and better preaching. That conviction shaped everything about the Dominicans. They weren't founded to retreat from debate. They were founded to enter it, not with slogans or emotional appeals, but with arguments. Careful ones, thoughtful ones, arguments rooted in scripture, philosophy, and lived experience. Dominicans are friars, not monks. That matters. Friars don't withdraw permanently into monasteries. They live among people. They preach publicly. They engage the intellectual currents of their time. And unlike some itinerant orders, Dominicans were intentionally tied to centers of learning. Very early on, the order embedded itself in universities. This wasn't accidental. Dominic understood that ideas shape belief long before belief shapes behavior. If false ideas go unchallenged, people don't just act differently. They understand reality differently. So Dominicans trained rigorously. Philosophy, theology, logic, scripture. They believed preaching without understanding was irresponsible. But understanding wasn't an end in itself. Dominican study exists for the sake of preaching, not preaching as performance, but preaching as explanation. Their goal wasn't to impress. It was to illuminate, to make truth accessible, to show how faith fits together, to remove obstacles rather than impose conclusions. This is why Dominican spirituality places such a strong emphasis on truth. Truth, for Dominicans, isn't abstract. It's personal. God is truth. To seek truth is to seek God. And to distort truth is not just an intellectual error. It's a moral one. Because confusion harms people, that belief gives Dominican life a particular seriousness. Their prayer is ordered. Their study is disciplined. Their preaching is precise. They are trained to ask not just whether something sounds persuasive, but whether it is actually true. And that concern for truth governs how they approach everything from theology to ethics to social questions. Dominicans are often associated with structured thinking and systematic theology. That reputation comes from their conviction that faith should be intelligible. Mystery exists, yes, but mystery doesn't mean nonsense. It means depth beyond exhaustion, not contradiction. This approach made Dominicans influential very quickly. They became professors, advisors, theologians, and teachers across Europe. They helped shape how Christianity engaged Aristotle, how doctrine was articulated, and how reason and revelation were understood to relate to one another. But this influence also made them controversial, because clarity can feel threatening, precision can feel unforgiving. And when people are deeply invested in certain ideas, being told those ideas are wrong can feel like an attack. Dominicans didn't always navigate this tension gently. At times, their commitment to truth hardened into severity, and yet, their internal logic remained consistent. If truth matters, then ambiguity has consequences. If error harms, then correction is an act of charity. This conviction shaped not only their preaching, but their communal life. Dominican communities revolve around common prayer, common study, and common mission. Authority exists, but it's intellectual as much as hierarchical. Arguments are expected. Disagreement is normal. What matters is how disagreement is resolved. Through reasoned dialogue, Dominicans believe that truth emerges not from silence, but from disciplined conversation. This gives their communities a distinctive culture, less mystical than some orders, less emotional, more argumentative, but also more rigorous. This doesn't mean Dominicans lack spirituality. It means their spirituality is intellectual. They pray with Scripture. They meditate on doctrine. They contemplate truth and then communicate it. Their classic rhythm is often summarized as contemplation leading to preaching. You don't preach what you haven't first thought through, and you don't think through what you haven't first prayed. That balance is central. Dominican preaching also differs in tone from more emotional styles. It tends to be explanatory rather than exhortative, structured rather than spontaneous, designed to lead listeners step by step, not overwhelm them with feeling. For some people, this is deeply compelling. For others, it feels cold. But Dominicans would argue that emotion without understanding is unstable. It fades. Understanding, once internalized, lasts. In the modern world, Dominicans continue to serve as teachers, theologians, ethicists, and pastors. They are heavily involved in academic theology, philosophy, and moral reasoning. They often engage questions that don't have easy answers: bioethics, justice, human dignity, and truth in public life. Their instinct is always the same: clarify the question, define the terms, examine the assumptions, follow the logic to its conclusion. This method can feel slow. It can feel frustrating, but it resists manipulation. It refuses shortcuts. Dominicans also emphasize the communal pursuit of truth. No individual, no matter how brilliant, owns truth alone. The study is done in the community. Teaching is accountable. Ideas are tested. This guards against ego, at least in theory. And yet, the temptation toward intellectual pride is real. Dominicans know this. That's why humility is emphasized alongside study. Knowledge is meant to serve others, not elevate oneself. The Dominican understanding of holiness reflects this balance. Holiness is not measured by mystical experiences or radical gestures. It's measured by fidelity to truth, charity in correction, patience in teaching, and integrity in speech. To lie is to fracture reality. To distort truth is to harm communion. These are not small matters. Today, the order of preachers remains one of the largest and most influential religious orders in the Catholic Church. Their influence isn't always visible. It shows up in textbooks, catechisms, ethical frameworks, and sermons shaped by careful thought. They remind the Church of something essential. Faith cannot survive on feeling alone. It needs understanding. It needs coherence. It needs truth that can be spoken clearly without fear. The Dominicans offer one answer to the Christian life. Love God with your mind. Seek truth wherever it leads. Speak clearly, even when it's uncomfortable. Trust that clarity, offered with charity, is a form of mercy. In a world saturated with information and starved for understanding, that vocation remains as urgent as ever. Number 7. The Order of Friars Minor Conventual Franciscans. If the Capuchins asked what happens when Franciscan poverty is pushed to its most austere extreme, the conventual Franciscans asked a different question. What happens when you try to live Francis's vision in the middle of cities, institutions, and long-term communities without abandoning it altogether? The Order of Friars Minor Conventual exists because the Franciscan ideal proved both powerful and difficult. Francis of Assisi envisioned a life without property, without security, without attachment. That vision inspired thousands. But as the movement grew, it collided with reality. People needed places to live. Communities needed stability. Ministries needed continuity. And the Church itself needed reliable structures. The conventual Franciscans emerged as one response to that tension. Their name hints at their identity. Conventual refers to convents, stable communal houses often located in towns and cities. Unlike the most radical interpretations of Franciscan poverty, the conventuals accepted that shared property and permanent residences could exist without betraying the spirit of Francis, as long as they were used for service rather than comfort. This decision changed everything. Where some Franciscans emphasized itinerancy and visible poverty, the conventuals emphasized presence. Not constant movement, but long-term availability. Not radical austerity, but sustainable simplicity. They didn't reject Francis's vision. They translated it into a form that could endure. That endurance made them especially effective in urban environments. As medieval cities grew, so did their problems. Poverty, disease, overcrowding, crime, and spiritual neglect are concentrated in dense populations. The conventual Franciscans settled in these spaces. They built friaries attached to churches. They offered preaching, confession, pastoral care, and charity to people who might never encounter a monastery or rural friar. Their poverty was communal rather than absolute. Individually, friars owned nothing, but the community could own buildings, books, and resources needed for ministry. This allowed the conventuals to educate members, preserve libraries, and maintain consistent outreach over generations. Critics saw this as a compromise. Conventionalists saw it as stewardship. They believed that Francis's poverty was never meant to be an end in itself. It was meant to free people for love, service, and humility. If structures helped achieve those goals without fostering greed or domination, then they could be justified. This perspective made the conventual Franciscans natural caretakers of institutions. They became parish priests, confessors, educators, and administrators. They were often entrusted with important churches and shrines. Perhaps the most famous example is the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi itself, which has long been entrusted to the conventual Franciscans. This alone signals how the Church understood its role. They were seen as reliable stewards of Francis's legacy, even if they lived it differently than some of his earliest followers. Spiritually, Conventual Franciscans retain the warmth and accessibility typical of Franciscan life. Their preaching emphasizes mercy, repentance, and joy. Their spirituality is effective rather than abstract. They speak to the heart more than the intellect, though they do not reject learning. In fact, the conventuals often bridge the gap between Franciscan simplicity and Dominican intellectual rigor. They engage theology, but without losing pastoral sensitivity. They valued education, but not as an end in itself. Knowledge mattered because it served people. This balance also shaped their community life. Conventual friaries tend to be larger than Capuchin houses and more structured than some other Franciscan communities. Prayer follows a regular rhythm. Meals are shared. Responsibilities are divided. Authority exists, but it is moderated by fraternity. The goal is not efficiency alone, but harmony. Their communal stability allows relationships to deepen over time. Friars become known in neighborhoods. Trust accumulates. People return again and again for confession, counsel, and guidance. The friars are no longer strangers. They are fixtures. That rootedness matters. Franciscan spirituality is deeply relational, and relationships require time. The conventional model allows friars to accompany people across decades, not just moments. They baptize children, counsel adults, bury the dead, and remain present through cycles of life that transient ministry can't always sustain. Conventual Franciscans also played a significant role in missionary activity. Their stability made them well suited to establish long-lasting missions rather than temporary outposts. They built churches, schools, and community centers that could survive beyond the first generation of missionaries. Their approach to mission emphasized integration rather than disruption. They didn't aim to impose foreign structures abruptly. They worked gradually, embedding themselves in local life while introducing Christian practice through relationship and service. Over time, this made the conventuals one of the largest Franciscan branches in the world. But size brought challenges. Institutional stability can drift toward comfort. Communal property can become an attachment. Long-standing influence can turn into complacency. Conventual Franciscans have wrestled with these dangers throughout their history. Periodic reforms emerged precisely because the Franciscan ideal always pulls against institutional gravity, and that tension never disappears. Conventual Franciscans live permanently in the space between Francis' radical poverty and the Church's practical needs. Their vocation is not to resolve that tension, but to inhabit it faithfully, to ask again and again whether structures are serving the mission or whether the mission has begun serving the structures. This self-questioning is part of their identity. In the modern world, conventual Franciscans continue to serve in parishes, universities, shrines, and social ministries across continents. They engage in youth work, pastoral counseling, education, and charity. Their presence is often quieter than that of more radical orders, but also more consistent. They don't shock the world into attention. They sustain it. Their Franciscan witness is not dramatic renunciation, but steady generosity. Not striking gestures, but faithful service. Not prophetic disruption, but pastoral accompaniment. That makes their holiness harder to romanticize, but also harder to dismiss. They remind the Church that Francis' vision was never meant to belong only to the heroic few. It was meant to shape ordinary Christian life. Prayer, community, humility, care for the poor, joy and simplicity, all lived not on the margins, but in the middle of society. The conventual Franciscans offer one particular answer to the Franciscan question. How do you live simply without disappearing? How do you remain poor without becoming unstable? How do you serve the church without losing Francis's spirit? Their answer is imperfect, ongoing, always in need of renewal. But it has endured. And in a church that must constantly balance ideal and reality, that endurance is itself a form of faithfulness. Number 8. The Congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer, Redemptorists. If the Dominicans were founded to bring clarity to confused minds, the Redemptorists were founded to bring hope to people who had been written off entirely. Not misunderstood, not merely uninformed, abandoned, spiritually neglected populations who lived on the margins of both society and the church. The Redemptorists begin with a disturbing realization that the gospel can be officially preached everywhere, yet effectively reach almost nowhere. That institutions can exist without access. That sacraments can be available in theory while remaining distant in practice. And that is when this gap widens. The people who suffer most are always the same: the poor, the rural, the isolated, the forgotten. Alphonsus Liguori, the founder of the Redemptorists, didn't set out to create a new religious order. He was already a priest, already educated, already successful, but success became a problem. His ministry initially focused on urban elites and intellectuals, and slowly, he realized something was wrong. The people most in need of pastoral care weren't showing up, so he went looking for them. What he found shocked him. Entire rural populations who barely knew the basics of the Christian faith, not because they rejected it, but because no one had taken the time to teach them in a way they could understand. Sermons were too abstract. Confession was inaccessible. Moral theology was framed in rigid categories that crushed consciences instead of forming them. And Alphonsus decided that this was unacceptable. The Redemptorists were founded with a very specific mission: to preach the gospel to the most abandoned, not the most powerful, not the most educated, the most neglected. And everything about their identity flows from that choice. They are missionaries by design, but not missionaries in the sense of distant foreign lands only. Redemptorist missions are often domestic, rural parishes, poor neighborhoods, places where priests are scarce and pastoral care is minimal. They go where regular parish structures fail to reach consistently. Their preaching style reflects this focus. Redemptorists emphasize clarity, accessibility, and mercy. They avoid theological abstraction. They speak plainly. They explain patiently. They believe that faith should be intelligible to ordinary people living ordinary lives. Complexity isn't holiness. Understanding is. This conviction also reshaped Catholic moral theology. Alphonsus Liguori became one of the most influential moral theologians in Catholic history precisely because he rejected extremes. He rejected harsh moral rigorism that crushed consciences with fear, and he rejected laxity that emptied morality of meaning. Instead, he emphasized discernment, intention, and mercy. For the Redemptorists, moral teaching exists to lead people toward freedom, not despair. This emphasis on mercy made them trusted confessors. People weren't afraid to approach them. They were known for listening, guiding, and encouraging rather than condemning. Their authority came not from fear, but from compassion rooted in realism. They understood something essential. People don't need more reasons to feel guilty. They need help believing redemption is possible. That belief is embedded even in the name Redemptorist. Their identity is tied directly to redemption, not as an abstract doctrine, but as a lived reality available to those who feel furthest from it. Redemptorist community life reflects this mission focus. Their houses are not cloistered. Their rhythm is shaped by missions, preaching schedules, retreats, and pastoral demands. Flexibility matters. Availability matters. The community exists to support the mission, not replace it. This outward orientation also shaped their global expansion. As populations shifted, as migration increased, and as industrialization displaced communities, Redemptorists followed. They went where pastoral care lagged behind social change. Immigrant communities, new industrial towns, frontier regions. Wherever people were spiritually underserved, Redemptorists found work to do. Their missionary success wasn't driven by innovation or strategy alone. It was driven by credibility. People listened because Redemptorists spoke their language, not just linguistically, but culturally and emotionally. They addressed fears people actually had, struggles they actually faced, moral dilemmas rooted in real life, not idealized theory. This groundedness became a defining trait. Redemptorists tend to distrust purely abstract solutions. They evaluate theology by its pastoral consequences. Does this teaching help people live better? Does it lead to hope or despair? Does it open doors or close them? If a theological system produces fear rather than conversion, they see that as a failure. This doesn't mean Redemptorists reject doctrine. They are deeply committed to church teaching, but they interpret doctrine through the lens of salvation history rather than control. God's goal is redemption. Everything else serves that goal. That orientation also makes them effective retreat leaders and spiritual directors. Redemptorist retreats are often emotionally intense, focused on repentance, forgiveness, and renewal. But the intensity is aimed toward liberation, not shame. The goal is to help people believe that change is possible, even after failure. Internally, Redemptorist spirituality emphasizes perseverance. They work with people who struggle repeatedly, who falls, who returns, who falls again. Their vocation is not to demand instant transformation, but to accompany slow conversion. This requires patience, and patience requires hope. That hope sustains them through difficult ministry. Serving abandoned populations is exhausting. Resources are limited. Gratitude is not guaranteed. Progress is slow. Redemptorists accept this as part of their calling. Their faith isn't built on visible success. It's built on fidelity to people who might never fully stabilize. In the modern world, this mission remains painfully relevant. Urban poverty, rural isolation, migration, addiction, family breakdown, spiritual disaffiliation. These are not abstract issues. They are lived realities. And Redemptorists continue to position themselves at these fault lines. They serve migrants, preach parish missions, lead retreats, engage social outreach, advocate for justice, but always with the same instinct: bring the message of redemption to those who feel excluded from it. They resist spiritual elitism. They resist moral perfectionism. They resist systems that prioritize order over mercy. This resistance doesn't come from rebellion. It comes from conviction. If God is a redeemer, then no one is disposable. If grace is real, then despair is never final. The Redemptorists represent one particular answer to the Christian life. Go where faith is weakest. Speak in ways people can understand. Teach morality as a path to freedom. Trust that redemption is stronger than failure. They don't seek attention. They seek access. And in doing so, they remind the church of something it can never afford to forget. The gospel is not most needed by those who already feel close to God. It is most needed by those who think it's no longer meant for them. Number 9. The Order of St. Augustine, Augustinians. If the Benedictines believed stability forms the soul and the Dominicans believed truth clarifies it, the Augustinians believed something else entirely. They believed the human heart is restless, not accidentally, not temporarily, but by design. And until that restlessness finds its proper home, no structure, no clarity, no discipline will ever be enough. The Order of St. Augustine begins not with a system, but with a confession. Augustine didn't start as a monk, a friar, or a reformer. He started as a seeker, brilliant, ambitious, and deeply dissatisfied. He chased pleasure. He chased success. He chased recognition, and none of it held. His insight, born out of personal failure rather than abstract theory, shaped everything that followed. The human heart is restless until it rests in God. That sentence isn't poetic decoration. It's anthropology. It's a diagnosis of what it means to be human. And the Augustinian order exists to take that diagnosis seriously. Unlike orders founded around a specific external mission, the Augustinians are founded around an interior question. What is the human person actually searching for? And why does that search so often go wrong? Augustine believed the answer lay in desire. Humans are not broken because they desire too much. They are broken because they desire the wrong things in the wrong order. Love itself isn't the problem. Disordered love is. When lower goods are treated as ultimate, they collapse under the weight they were never meant to carry. This insight gave Augustinian spirituality a unique tone. It is deeply psychological, relational, and introspective. It doesn't begin by condemning human longing. It begins by examining it. What do you love? Why do you love it? What do you expect it to give you? These questions are not rhetorical. They are spiritual tools. The Augustinian order organizes religious life around community rather than solitude. Augustine believed isolation intensified disorder. Left alone, desire curves inward. Community, by contrast, forces love outward. It confronts selfishness. It requires patience. It exposes illusion. For Augustinians, community is not optional. It is the context in which healing happens. They live together, pray together, share goods, resolve conflict together. Their model is not the hermit seeking perfection alone, but the community seeking truth together. And that togetherness shapes everything from governance to spirituality. Augustinian authority is meant to be pastoral rather than authoritarian. Leaders are not distant managers. They are shepherds within the same community. This doesn't eliminate hierarchy, but it softens it. Authority exists to protect unity, not assert dominance. That emphasis on unity is central. Augustinians believe division is not merely a social problem. It is a spiritual wound. When community fractures, love becomes distorted. Pride replaces charity. Power replaces trust. So Augustinian life constantly returns to reconciliation, humility, and shared purpose. This makes their spirituality especially suited to pastoral ministry. Augustinians often serve as parish priests, educators, chaplains, and spiritual guides. Their approach emphasizes relationship over instruction, listening over lecturing, accompaniment over correction. They want to understand before they speak. But understanding does not mean relativism. Augustinians cared deeply about truth. Augustine himself was a fierce intellectual. But truth, for Augustinians, is inseparable from love. Knowledge that does not build communion is incomplete. A doctrine that does not heal division is misused. This conviction shapes how Augustinians approach teaching and theology. They are less interested in constructing airtight systems than in addressing existential questions. Suffering, meaning, time, memory, freedom, grace, sin, desire. These are not academic topics for them. They are lived realities. That focus gives Augustinian thought a timeless quality. Augustine doesn't feel outdated because he speaks to interior struggles that never disappear. Anxiety, ambition, shame, loneliness. These are as modern as they are ancient. Augustinian spirituality meets people where they actually are, not where they're supposed to be. This realism also informs their understanding of grace. Augustinians emphasize that humans cannot save themselves, not because they are worthless, but because their loves are disordered. Willpower alone cannot reorient the heart. Grace is not a reward for effort. It is a gift that makes transformation possible. This belief produces humility rather than passivity. You still strive. You still choose. But you don't pretend you are self-made. Grace becomes the foundation of hope rather than a threat to freedom. Historically, the Augustinian order emerged as a way of organizing clergy around a common life rather than solitary ministry. This allowed priests to support one another emotionally and spiritually, reducing isolation and burnout. Community wasn't just spiritual idealism, it was pastoral wisdom. Over time, Augustinians became deeply involved in education. Schools, universities, and seminaries offered natural environments for their approach. Education, for them, isn't just about transferring information. It's about forming desire, helping students learn not just how to think, but what to love. That formation requires patience. Augustinians don't expect instant conversion or immediate clarity. They understand growth as gradual, nonlinear, marked by setbacks. Augustine's own life proved that transformation is often messy. This makes them compassionate toward failure. They don't panic when people struggle. They don't assume doubt is betrayal. They don't confuse questioning with rejection. They see struggle as part of the journey rather than evidence of its absence. In the modern church, Augustinians continue to serve in parishes, universities, and missions around the world. Their influence is often subtle. They don't dominate debates. They shape conversations. Their presence is felt less in headlines and more in hearts, slowly changing direction. They remind the church of something essential. You cannot command love. You cannot legislate desire. You cannot argue someone into rest. You accompany them until they find it. The Augustinian vision of holiness is not heroic. It is honest. It acknowledges contradiction. It accepts weakness. It trusts grace. Holiness emerges not from suppressing desire, but from reordering it. That reordering happens slowly, through prayer, through community, through failure and forgiveness, through learning to love rightly. The Augustinians offer one answer to the Christian life. Take your restlessness seriously. Examine what you love. Let the community correct you. Trust that grace can heal what you cannot fix alone. In a world filled with distractions and false promises of fulfillment, that answer remains deeply relevant. Because beneath every ambition, every addiction, every anxiety, the same question waits. Where does the heart finally rest? Number 10. The Society of the Divine Word Missionaries. If the Augustinians began with the restlessness of the human heart, the Divine Word missionaries begin with something even more fundamental. Language. Not language as grammar or vocabulary, but language as connection, as meaning, as the bridge between God and humanity. The Society of the Divine Word was founded on a conviction that feels obvious once it is stated. but radical once you follow it through. If God reveals himself as the Word, then the gospel can never be separated from culture, communication, and understanding. Faith does not exist in abstraction. It always arrives clothed in language, symbols, customs, and stories. And if those are ignored, the message doesn't just fail to land, it fails to exist at all. The Divine Word missionaries were founded with a global mission at their core, not as a secondary activity, not as a specialization, as their reason for being. From the beginning, they assumed Christianity was meant to cross borders, cultures, and worldviews, and that doing so responsibly required more than enthusiasm. It required listening. Unlike earlier missionary movements that sometimes equated evangelization with cultural replacement, the Divine Word approach begins with encounter. Who are these people? How do they think? How do they understand meaning, family, authority, suffering, and hope? What words already carry spiritual weight for them? These questions aren't preliminary. They are theological. Because for Divine Word missionaries, revelation is not merely content. It is communication. And communication fails when it ignores context. This mindset shaped the order's formation process deeply. Divine Word missionaries are trained to be linguists, anthropologists, educators, and bridge builders. Cultural competence is not optional. Language study is not a tool. It is a vocation. Many members learn multiple languages, not as a skill set, but as an expression of respect. To speak someone's language is to take them seriously. This approach also shapes how Divine Word missionaries understand humility. They don't arrive as experts who already know what people need. They arrive as learners, guests, observers. They assume that God was already present before they arrived, already working within the culture they're entering. Their task is not to replace that presence, but to recognize it. This posture radically changes the mission. Mission is no longer conquest. It is dialogue. It is a translation. It is a mutual transformation. The missionary is changed by the encounter just as much as the community is. That doesn't mean the Divine Word missionaries abandon conviction. They are deeply committed to the gospel, but they believe the gospel is rich enough to be expressed in countless forms without losing its substance. Uniformity is not faithfulness. Understanding is. This belief led them to focus strongly on education and communication. Divine Word missionaries have been deeply involved in schools, seminaries, publishing, media, and formation programs around the world. Wherever communication shapes culture, they see a mission field. They also developed strong expertise in contextual theology. Rather than exporting European theological frameworks unchanged, they encouraged local theological reflection. How does Christian faith speak within this culture's symbols? How does it address this society's wounds? How does it resonate with these people's hopes? These questions don't weaken doctrine. They deepen it. Internally, the Divine Word community life reflects its global identity. Their communities are often intentionally multicultural. Different languages, nationalities, and backgrounds living together. This isn't accidental. It's formative. Living cross-culturally forces patience, humility, and flexibility. You can assume your way of thinking is universal when you share daily life with people who prove it isn't. That experience becomes a lived theology. Divine Word missionaries also emphasize collaboration with local communities rather than replacement. They don't aim to remain permanently dominant. Their goal is to support local leadership, local clergy, and local expressions of faith. Success, for them, includes becoming unnecessary. This is a difficult ideal. It requires letting go of control. It requires trusting others. It requires resisting the temptation to measure impact by visibility. But it aligns with their core belief. The Word takes flesh locally, not globally, in one uniform form. In the modern world, the divine Word mission feels especially urgent. Globalization connects cultures, but also intensifies misunderstanding. Migration brings people of different faiths and backgrounds into constant contact. Digital communication amplifies voices while flattening nuance. Miscommunication fuels conflict faster than ever. In this environment, the divine word charism becomes prophetic. They remind the church that proclamation without understanding becomes noise, that speaking without listening becomes domination, that truth spoken without love fails to persuade. They engage in interreligious dialogue not as a compromise, but as an encounter. They believe dialogue does not weaken faith, it clarifies it. You understand what you believe more deeply when you encounter what others believe sincerely. This openness sometimes draws suspicion. Some worry that dialogue leads to relativism, that listening replaces conviction. But divine word missionaries would argue the opposite. The conviction that cannot survive an encounter was never strong to begin with. Truth does not fear translation. Only insecurity does. This confidence shapes their spirituality. Divine word prayer emphasizes incarnation, God entering history, God speaking in human language, God accepting limitation to be understood. This becomes the model for the mission itself. To communicate is to risk misunderstanding. To love is to accept vulnerability. The divine word vocation embraces both. Their understanding of holiness reflects this outward orientation. Holiness is not withdrawal from difference. It is a faithful presence within it. Patience, curiosity, respect, perseverance. These become spiritual disciplines. They also emphasize justice, particularly where cultural misunderstanding leads to exploitation. Colonial history, economic inequality, racial tension, migration. These are not side issues. They are communication failures with moral consequences. And divine word missionaries engage them as part of their mission. Today, the Society of the Divine Word is one of the largest missionary congregations in the Catholic Church. Its members serve across continents, often in places marked by cultural intersection and tension. Their influence is less visible than some orders, but deeply embedded in local communities. They rarely dominate institutions. They accompany them. They rarely control narratives. They help translate them. They offer the church a final reminder that brings this entire series full circle. Catholicism is not one culture speaking loudly. It is many cultures listening carefully. The divine word missionaries embody a vision of faith that moves outward without erasing difference, that speaks boldly without shouting, and that trusts understanding more than force. Their question to the church is simple but demanding. Are you willing to be understood before you are obeyed? Are you willing to listen before you speak? Are you willing to let the word take flesh again and again in forms you did not design? In a world fractured by misunderstanding, that question may be one of the most urgent religious questions of all. And the divine word missionaries live as though the answer matters. Not in theory, but in every language they learn, every culture they enter, every life they choose to understand before they try to change it.